In the dead of a Hokkaido winter, a boy named Naoki Yoshida crossed the street to a friend's house because the kid who lived there had figured out a new way to play. There was a Famicom hooked up to the television, running a game called Mario Bros, and what got Yoshida, before anything else, was the controller. A television had always been a thing you sat and looked at. Now, with that controller in his hands, he could reach into the screen and make the little man move. What the friend had figured out was a trick, and kind of a mean one. In Mario Bros, you could flip an enemy onto its back, and if you hit it again, you stood it right back up. The friend used that to revive every enemy the instant Yoshida cleared it, so the boy just kept losing round after round. He went home hating the kid, and at the same time, he wanted to do the same thing to someone else with a game of his own. That was a strange ambition for a kid who could barely afford to play. There wasn't much money at home in Hakodate, the port town where he grew up, and most games cost more than he had. 50 yen in an arcade bought a set amount of play, and he knew exactly how much. He would pour hundreds of hours into a single game, wringing it dry before it was done with him, and when his own coins ran out, he would stand behind the players who were better than him and study how they did it for free. Then years later came Dragon Quest. It hit him harder than any book or film ever had, and this time, what stuck more than anything else was the story. A whole world you could walk through, collecting quests that were all yours alone to carry. Mario was what made him want to make games, and now, Dragon Quest made him want to build worlds of his own and write the stories that lived inside them. By his teens, the plan was set. He was going to make games, no more questions about it. But in the meantime, he was getting frighteningly good at playing them, mailing his high scores off to the arcade magazines and watching them turn up in the national rankings. Afterburner 2, the Sega flight game everyone fed their coins to, was second in the entire country. Well, at least according to him. He had also talked his way into running the game corner of a busy toy shop. A part-timer the store trusted with the actual buying, and on the slow afternoons, he read Famitsu cover to cover. When it came time to actually break in, the studio he dreamed of was Chunsoft, the house that had made Dragon Quest itself. But the money wasn't there, so Chunsoft was out. The other way in was through a game design school run by Hudson Soft, with an internship attached that would get him working and earning sooner. He took the Hudson one, so his mother could stop worrying about money a little earlier, and that settled it. So he packed up, left the North, and in 1993, he went to find out if he could actually make them. Turned out, he could. He got there by taking the work nobody else wanted, the broken projects, the ones with the deadline already bearing down, putting his hand up for them while the senior people looked the other way. Young as he was, they started handing him real work, and mostly, that meant writing. Scenarios for a fantasy series called Far East of Eden, then a Bomberman game, where he took the little round guy whose whole purpose is blowing things up and built a real hero around him. He had also taught himself to read code, enough to stand in a room full of programmers and hold his own in their language. That was the day job. What actually had hold of him ran at night, online, in other people's worlds. It started when someone older at the office pointed him toward a game called Ultima Online. He logged in, and there were 3,000 people in there all at once, sharing one world, and they lived it. You could track a deer through the woods, kill it, tan the hide, stitch the leather into a vest, sell the vest to somebody who wanted one, and put the money toward a house of your own. So Yoshida, being Yoshida, ran two characters simultaneously. One was a gentleman, a lord, gracious to every stranger he met. The other was a murderer, a player killer who existed for no reason on earth except to find someone having a good night and ruin it. He played them both, all the way, the saint and the killer, at once. One game was never going to be enough. When EverQuest came out, you almost couldn't get a copy in Japan, so on his trips down to Tokyo for work, he would comb Akihabara, shop to shop, counter to counter, asking the same thing at every till. You got EverQuest? You got EverQuest? Like a zombie, until somebody finally said yes. But like many other hobbies in Japan at the time, none of that paid the bills. The one that actually does was Bomberman. He did pour his heart and soul into that one too. And one day, a manager above him looked at what he did for a living and called it kid stuff. To Yoshida, that got it exactly backward. A game could reach anyone, a child, a grown adult, or somebody's grandfather, and the fun in it never came stamped with an age. It was the reason he had poured his nights into those worlds in the first place. And here was a man who looked at all of that and saw children's games, and who happened to outrank him. The insult he could have lived with. A boss who genuinely believed it, he could not. So the moment the words were out of the manager's mouth, he told him he was done. He had wanted to be at Hudson since he was a kid, back when it was one of the biggest names in the business. Now, he walked out anyway. After that, with the experience now behind him, he didn't have to look far for somewhere to land. The people he had come up with at Hudson had already gone off to start a studio of their own, up in Sapporo, called Rocket. They wanted him, so he went. And at Rocket, he finally got what he had been working toward the whole way along, a world of his own to build. It was an online action RPG for Windows. The dungeons remade themselves every time you went down, so the place was never the same way twice. New ground unfolding under your feet every single time. He drew the whole thing up, every system, every rule of how it ran, and he poured himself into it, the way you only can when the thing is finally yours. A producer named Yosuke Saito, who loved the same games he did, came on to make it real. Enix, a Japanese multimedia publisher, agreed to put up the money. His name was on it, and after everything, maybe it was going to be his to keep. But in the end, like other beautiful things, this didn't last. In 2003, Square and Enix merged to form Square Enix. The new management looked at his game and wanted it to be something else. It had to run on the PlayStation 2 now, not just the PC, and tie into their own online service. So the team had to rebuild it to fit. But then the demands shifted again, and they rebuilt it a second time. Then it was shelved for whatever reasons no one cares enough to name. The first game he ever designed died in a meeting he wasn't in over a merger he had nothing to do with. Saito, though, wasn't ready to let it go. There was a way to come back to the whole thing, he told Yoshida. He called it taking their revenge, and Yoshida said yes. The revenge Saito had in mind ran through Square Enix itself. He was an executive there now, and he had a new project he wanted Yoshida on, a new Dragon Quest. Saying yes meant Tokyo and leaving Rocket, the studio his old Hudson friends had built to go make a world for the same company that had just killed his last one. Before he left, his old boss sat him down, the man who had brought him into Rocket and had known Yoshida for a long time now. He told him it would be tough, that he would be sorry to see him go, but that he should take the job anyway. Then he asked for two things in return. Climb all the way to the top of Square Enix and become an executive. Whatever happened up there, send some work back our way. Yoshida promised him both and went on to the next chapter of his life. The Dragon Quest they put him on was going somewhere the series never had, online, for the first time. A game you logged into and lived in, a world that kept running whether you were there or not. He came on as the fourth person on the team, riding it shoulder to shoulder with Yuji Horii, the man who created it. And he was good at it. Within a couple of years, the game's director handed him the reins, and Yoshida became the acting director of the whole thing. The core systems were built under him, and he ran the project for the next year and a half. It was the deepest he had ever been inside a living world. But again, he didn't get to keep this one either. Square Enix had a rule, one director to a project. Yoshida had only ever been acting, covering for Fujisawa, the real director, while he was away. When he came back to it full time, there was only room for one. So they moved Yoshida out. He was away on a business trip when it happened, and came back to find the chair filled and his name removed from the project. After that, no one was quite sure what to do with him, or with the two others cast out beside him. Hiroshi Takai, who had just directed his first game, and Hiroshi Minagawa, who had spent a career making other people's games beautiful. The company had a name for the three of them anyway, Stray Dogs. In 2009, the studio sent them off together to study how the big Western studios built their games. What they gave Yoshida to build was a long shot, an experimental game that would end up cancelled. He spent it teaching the younger developers under him how to run a game of their own one day, even though he didn't even have one himself. The next thing they handed him was an arcade game about cars for parents and kids to play together. And around the same time, in another corner of the company, things were on fire. In the autumn of 2010, Square Enix launched the 14th Final Fantasy, a brand new online world, and it came out as the worst reviewed game the series had ever put its name on. And Yoshida, he was off with his toy cars while the company's flagship went down. It had taken 5 years and a room full of people to build the thing that burned. Go back to the start of it, to the room, the people in it, the fact that every one of them came to work certain they were going to win, which given what they were walking into was close to insane. In November 2004, an American studio called Blizzard released World of Warcraft, and it gave the whole industry a heart attack, becoming the most popular world anyone had ever built. It was a place where more than 12 million people paid to live, month after month, year after year. A world that never closed its doors. The whole business looked at that and saw a gold rush. That dream, a revenue stream that never ran dry, hit the publishing world hard. So like every gold rush before it, the building began. Every publisher with the cash to try went chasing a subscription of its own. The press had the headline ready before any of them even shipped. The WoW killers, they would call those. Some of them were good games, but that didn't matter much. They all failed, just like every WoW killer before them, and every one that would come after. Tabula Rasa came and went inside a year and a half. Warhammer Online drew an enormous crowd on launch day, then spent the next year watching it file back out the door. A lucky few survived by tearing up the subscription model and going free. Most just died. Because the people who had already disappeared into World of Warcraft were not about to start paying a second monthly bill to live somewhere else. There was only ever room for one. WoW Killer, the press kept calling them. And one after another, the name turned into a headstone instead. If anything was ever going to kill World of Warcraft, it was only ever going to be World of Warcraft itself. Except one company had already pulled this off once, and they were the ones in the room. Years before WoW existed, Square had already built an online Final Fantasy of its own, Final Fantasy XI. Back then, the man who had created the whole series, Hironobu Sakaguchi, was still in the building, and it had worked. While the rest of the series made its money in one big wave of sales, then went quiet afterward. Final Fantasy XI made it slowly, off a smaller crowd who paid every month and stayed for years. Add all those months up, and that unglamorous online game had out-earned every Final Fantasy before it, even the blockbusters. They had earned it the honest way. To build 11, the team went out and bought up the Western MMOs. Ultima Online, EverQuest, all of them, lined up and played through to see how it all worked. Sakaguchi himself got so deep into EverQuest that he filled pages with notes from his own nights playing it, and sent them in to talk the rest of the team into going online at all. They were a company that did its homework. When the gold rush came, everyone else was shoving chips onto a table they had never sat at. Square had already sat at it before. To them, a second online Final Fantasy was a homecoming more than anything else. Around 2005, the project got greenlit. Another online Final Fantasy, bigger than 11, was built on everything 11 had gotten right. They had, after all, been right before. So they built it the same way they had built the first one. A few hundred of them went down into the work of actually making it, the ones who would turn out to be the first to feel it come apart in their hands. One of them was a man named Koji Fox. He was American, and he had gotten to that room by just about the least likely road there is. As a kid, he loved Japanese games so much that he sat down and learned the whole language, just so he could play them the way they were meant to be played. That eventually took him to Japan, where he turned out to be tall enough that somebody took one look at him and made him the local basketball coach. He taught English in the daytime. At night, he went home and vanished into Final Fantasy XI. Then one day, he answered an ad for a translator at Square Enix, and that was that. Now, he ran the English localization team. His job was to rebuild the entire game in another language, word by word, which made him one of the first people alive to see the new Final Fantasy whole, every system, every piece. The first thing about these people was how good they were, and how sure of it. They made the best looking games in the business. They had earned that confidence, every inch of it. Every team was in love with its own corner of the thing, the artists most of all. Someone had built what people in that building would tell you, with total sincerity, the most beautiful barrel ever put in a video game. They had built that barrel the way they built everything, by hand, one at a time, like swordsmiths making katanas, while the rest of the industry had moved on to turning them out by the thousand. A single barrel had as many polygons packed into it as a whole human character. So did the flower pots. It got so heavy with all that handmade detail that once players actually showed up, the screen could only hold about 20 players at a time. Koji kept piecing the game together, and underneath all the beauty, the same problem kept surfacing. They had built it on the wrong engine. It had been made years earlier for an ordinary Final Fantasy, the single-player kind, where one hero walks through a story and the story ends. Nobody ever built it to run a world. And now, here they were, asking it to be one. Open day and night, thousands of strangers moving through it at once. Obviously, it buckled. There was never any way it wasn't going to. The people who might have fixed it weren't around either. The company was building that engine across every project at once, which had pulled its best programmers off everything else, including this game. So the whole thing came together slow and thin and half finished. Enormous, gorgeous, and mostly hollow. The simplest problem of all sat under even that, the one no patch was ever going to touch. It just wasn't any fun to play. Koji could feel exactly where that came from because he had come up through Final Fantasy XI. He had watched it win the slow, unfashionable way on nothing but patience. Now, the same room was building the new game exactly the way they had built the old one. Sure, it would work because it always had. He could see all of it coming. The launch date was already set. It was coming whether the game was ready or not. On the 13th of June 2010, Square Enix announced September 13th, a little over 3 months away as the release date. Now it was a promise to the shareholders, the retailers, the hundreds of thousands who had been waiting 5 years. So they ran at it. For the last 3 months, the team all but lived at the office. They put everything they had into hitting that date, working the hours people work when the deadline is fixed and the game is not. A lot of them did it with the doubt already in the air. The one thing left was the open beta, the game's last real chance to put it in front of a crowd and catch the worst before anyone paid. It was set for the 31st of August, but got pulled on the same day for critical bugs. Then, it didn't actually start until the 2nd of September. The date didn't move an inch to wait for it. The beta just ran its last few weeks straight into release, the bugs still crawling all over it in plain view of anyone who logged in. The same bug kept popping up in meetings and hallways. It still wasn't fixed. By the end, nobody was sure anymore that it ever could be. It was one of Koji's own localizers who finally couldn't carry it, so he sat down and wrote it all out, everything the room had been too stubborn to move on from. Then he sent it, straight past the chain of command, past even his own team, who had no idea he was doing it. It reached everyone, at once, the whole development team, hundreds of people, and it changed nothing at all. By then, it wasn't only one email. The people making the game had started saying the same thing through the proper channels too, carefully on the record. The company heard them, and went anyway. The reasoning was hard to argue with, because it had already come true once. Final Fantasy XI had launched rough as well, years back, a real mess. They had patched it, and turned it into the game that ended up paying for everything. So they would just do it again this time. Yet this time, things were different. On the 30th of September 2010, Final Fantasy XIV went out into the world. Exactly as promised, exactly on schedule, and almost entirely unfixed. The people who had bought it took it home and sat down to play. There were a lot of them. Something like 600,000 copies went out the door in that first stretch, a real turnout for a Final Fantasy. After 5 years, the crowd they had built the whole world to hold had finally arrived. But the world they walked into was empty. You could run across open country in there for 20 minutes for nothing. The cities never filled. All those people had shown up, and out in the fields, you were somehow always alone, and the game could barely keep up with you. You would go to open your bag and wait. Try to stand up and wait again. 2 seconds, maybe 5, every goddamn single time, while the server somewhere far off decided whether to let it happen or not. Push through all that, and the game still had one more thing for you. It was set up so that the more you played, the less it gave you. A system inside it counted your hours, and past a certain point, a whole afternoon could earn you almost nothing on a game you were paying for by the month. So as fast as they had come, they left. In a matter of weeks, it thinned out. The world built to hold a crowd went quiet and stayed that way. By then, the talk had stopped being about the game at all and climbed up to the name on the box. Out in the world, people were writing that Final Fantasy itself was finished, the whole series, more than 20 years of it, dragged under by this one single game. The ones still hoping for it just looked pathetic for bothering. Inside the building, the same fear ran quieter and deeper. Maybe they couldn't keep doing this at all. The company couldn't even bring itself to charge for it. The free month stretched to 2. Down in localization, Koji's team stopped translating a game. For months, what they translated was apologies. The patch notes, the notices, the official word were all some version of "we're sorry, we know, we're working on it." Koji read what people were saying about the thing he had given years of his life to. He wanted to defend it. These were the best people he had ever worked with. Friends of his, going back to his Final Fantasy XI days. People who had just poured the last of themselves into it. He wanted to grab the strangers who were tearing it apart and tell them they didn't understand, that they hadn't seen what he had seen. But he couldn't, because they did understand. They were right. And Koji knew that if he had been on the other side of it, just some guy who had saved up and bought the thing and taken it home, he would have said every word they were saying. In the autumn of 2010, Final Fantasy XIV was failing in front of the whole world, the most expensive disaster the company had on its hands in years. It was the kind of wreck a careful man would keep his distance from. Yoshida went the other way. A man who had no part in the disaster walked into the office of Yoichi Wada, the president of Square Enix, and made the case that the whole company should drop everything and save the thing. He wasn't acting alone, though. The people still fighting to save the game had been coming to him for weeks, after hours, with their worries. Surprisingly, Wada decided to hear them out. So in late November, the studio made the call. Hiromichi Tanaka, who had run the launch, took the blame and stepped down. And that December, both of his jobs came to Yoshida, the producer's chair and the director's, and the whole of Final Fantasy XIV, now his. To Yoshida, it was the chance to work on a numbered Final Fantasy, one of the crown jewels of the company, and he took it gladly, even if he never really liked the public nonsense that his job would put him in. Except this chance was a crater. But first, he had to look at who he had been handed. The team had come with the wreck. Most of them were the people who had built the failure in the first place, and to most of them, he was a stranger, straight off Dragon Quest and an arcade game about cars. The exception was Hiroshi Minagawa, one of the stray dogs who was also cast out beside him a few years back, pulled back in to help. So he told them straight, if they didn't like the way he worked, they could leave, no hard feelings. All he wanted was 3 months. The room split. A few were in. Plenty thought it was hopeless and said so to his face. A couple were angry he had even asked at all. The first to say yes was a sound guy named Masayoshi Soken, and he's the one Yoshida still remembers. So he and the remaining people got to work. Over the next month or two, they combed the whole game and wrote down every change they wanted. The list ran past 10,000 entries, and the answer was one nobody was going to like. so he laid out two options for the people upstairs. The safe one was to patch what they had, claw back some of the money, and live with the result. It will cost them the Final Fantasy name, maybe for good this time. The other option was lunacy, and it was the one he wanted. They would keep the failed game running and the money coming in, and in secret, build a brand new Final Fantasy XIV from the ground up. Same name, same world, and one day it will walk out and take the old one's place. He argued it was the only way back to the players, the one shot at making them look up and see Final Fantasy doing something crazy again. And this time, even the money people came down on his side in the end. Risky, the CFO said, but necessary. So the aim was to have the new game ready by the end of 2012. First though, they had to keep the old game alive long enough to replace it. And for half a year, it was so fragile that even pushing on it made him come apart in their hands. When he sat down to play it himself, he lasted about 5 minutes, and spent most of them trying to get out. He couldn't even work out how to quit. Every time he clicked the little X in the corner, a box would pop up warning him his progress might not be saved, so he would click no, and it would drop him back straight into the world. Click the X again, same warning, back in again. Years before, he had taught himself to write code, so he knew the warning was bullshit. It saved to the server every few seconds, and the whole thing had been built for PC, except you couldn't play it without plugging in a controller. Then he got to the fighting and found there was barely any to it. 15 people could pile into one party, and the healer would cast the strongest heal over and over without ever running out, so the group just stood there out-healing whatever they fought. The thing didn't even have auto-attack a year after it launched. So he set about fixing it. The interface came first, then the fighting, then everything else. He put Minagawa on nothing but the menus, building a way to run the whole game cleanly from a controller. The whole rebuild ran off one enormous spreadsheet, and he broke the work down even further. Every single move a class like the Dragoon could make was its own line on the sheet, with its own spec that took a couple of hours to write. He read every one of them himself, 15 minutes apiece. Each person had to put 2 numbers on a task, the fastest they thought they could finish it, and the slowest they would admit to. Then he watched whose work kept coming in at the slow end, and quietly patted that person's next guess. And the worst offender of all was himself. He did the repairs out in the open, a patch at a time, where anyone still playing could watch. He tore out the system that had been punishing people for staying on too long. The marketplace, 20 near identical rooms you walk through one by one to buy a single potion, became a single search box. Players got a chocobo to ride again. The old Final Fantasy jobs came back, the paladins, the dragoons, and the black mages, each one with a quest line you had to earn. Month after month, another patch. The dying game a little less broken than the month before, and all the while, out of sight, he was building the bigger one, a whole new game from scratch. They started it with a new engine. He split the team and put some of them on keeping the old game alive while the rest got on with building its replacement. He made something like 400 of the big calls up front all at once, so nobody would ever have to stop and wait on him for an answer. Most of his current programmers had never built an online game in their lives, so he made them learn the systems that already worked, inside and out, before he would let them write any of the new one. And the whole time he was playing World of Warcraft, the biggest game in the business, and trying to learn what worked. The patches the players had been getting were the new game's parts, getting their first run on live players before the new game even existed. They held on for as long as they could. The new game still wasn't finished. A rebuild from nothing usually took 4 or 5 years, and he didn't have that long. But it was coming, one way or another. He had done his part, the impossible part, in secret. But in the end, the one thing he couldn't build was whether the players who had walked away would ever come back. The game had been out for 2 years now. It had launched broken, and the hundreds of thousands who came to see it gave it a few weeks and then gave up, until the huge world they had come for stood all but empty. But not everyone had walked away though. A stubborn few still logged in every night because they weren't done with the place yet. They had stayed, their friends had stayed, and the rest of the world thought a lot of them were mad for it. All the while though, there was something in the sky. A small red star had shown up over the land one day. Far off, easy to miss. Then, patch by patch, month by month, it came closer. It got bigger. It turned from a dot into a second moon, hanging fat and red over everything. Lower every time they logged in, until by the end, it had swelled bigger than the sun and seemed to fill the whole sky. Deep down, everyone knew, more or less, what was coming. The thing they tried to hold so deeply was slipping away. It should have been hope, and for some of them, it was. But they had loved dead games before. Every last one of them gone into the ground and never came back up, so they knew better than to hope too hard. Maybe this was just a funeral with a nicer ending than most, and they were about to lose the thing they loved all over again. And then the last night came. They threw the doors open for the end. Free. That last little while. Come one, come all. And they came. The faithful and a wave of the ones who had left years before. All back to see the place off. Whole servers of them gathered up and went walking. On foot and on the backs of their big yellow birds, in one long ragged column out across the land to the field where it would finish. There they gathered, the whole server of them, while the world came apart at their backs, monsters loose in the streets, the sky gone red and low, and they waited for the end. Finally it came. The second moon they had watched fall for a year broke open at last, and when Bahamut spread its wings, everything ended. It wasn't clean, of course. Half of them spent the last night fighting the login screen instead of looking at the dragon, thrown out by the crowds, watching the death of their world through a friend's stream, while they hammered a key that wouldn't let them back in. One man got knocked offline half an hour before the end and never got back in at all. Another clawed his way in for the final 15 minutes and stood on a hill outside the city with the people from his guild, just to be there when the lights went out. A lot of them cried that night. Grown adults at their keyboards in the small hours, and they'll say so now without a flicker of embarrassment. And then for a long time, there was nothing. Just a black square on the screen where a world used to be. Months of it. The people who had stayed to the end had stayed for what came next, and now there was nowhere to log into. But they couldn't put it down even then. The story had gone dark mid-sentence. The old mage last seen standing in the path of the fire, and it had never told them whether he lived. They carried it for months, a small, ridiculous grief for a man who was never real, in a world that wasn't there to go back to. They had all told the place goodnight instead of goodbye, like they would be back when it woke up, but nobody had ever brought a game back from this far down. Then the test version opened a few months early, and the dead game got mobbed, servers buckling under 100,000 people and more, climbing past anything they had built for, all of them piling into a beta of a game the world had written off and coming back out saying the one thing nobody had said about it in years, that it was actually good. And then, it was real. The world came back on the 27th of August 2013, the same one they had lost, remade, the same cities and the same map with all the broken sanded off. They walked back into it a year older, and it was theirs once again. And it remembered them too. Those who had stayed to the end got their names written into the credits of the world they had refused to let die. Then the servers fell over again, but this time it was because everyone was trying to get in at once. People would sit at the login screen for an hour, 2 hours, thrown back by a line that years before would have broken their hearts and now read like the best news on earth. The world is full. So full, the company had to do the strangest thing of all and stop selling the game, pull it off the shelves, because they couldn't build the place fast enough for everyone trying to move in. The ones who had stuck with the broken thing came back to a whole one and loved it more than they ever had. The dead game had climbed up out of the ground, and now the whole world wanted in. The song was still there too, the same voice that had sung the old world out, that had played on the wind while the moon came down. Now it was the sound of the new one, the song that played them home. And this time, it wasn't going anywhere. The Final Fantasy, finally reborn and beloved. Yoshida had just brought a dead Final Fantasy back to life, and he seemed to be the only person in the building who thought it had bought him nothing. To him, the rescue was just the starting line. He was sure an online game lived or died on its first big expansion, and he said it so often the team teased him for it. So he poured everything into building one, Heavensward, the first Final Fantasy he had ever made from the ground up, the world and the story and the music, all his. The first thing he reached for was a country that had only ever been a rumor, a nation of knights and dragons that had sat up on the old map from the start, at war with the sky. Except you could never go there. It was just a line of text. So he had to build it for real, every street of it, and took it all the way into the dark, a high and grand and proper Gothic. Onto the new country, he piled 3 new jobs and a whole new playable race, and then the big one. He let you fly, which meant building the whole world twice over. The moment you could climb off the ground and look down, every roof and street had to hold together from above. So they went back and remade all of those, down to the smallest textures. They were writing as much world as they were building, the history of the place and the myth under it, far more than any player would ever see in the game itself. So much so that something like 80% of it never made it in at all. And rather than waste it, they put it in a book, an encyclopedia of a place that mostly didn't exist. Then they translated it all into English, which doubled the work, and they swore they would never do anything like it again, right before they started on the second volume. Every bit of this they were building on top of the live game, which still needed a fresh patch every few months. Keeping that running and building the expansion at the same time was something they had never done and never worked out how to do, and it came close to taking them apart. The worst of it found Yoshida on a press tour, standing in a castle in France, when word came that they had run out of translators and weren't going to make the date. He got on the phone to an old friend back home and begged him, outright, for 2 more people for 2 months. His localization lead was still translating the small stuff the day before the deadline, screaming across the office that there were 200 more to go. Heavensward shipped. In the end, the country of knights and dragons made real, as good as anything they had ever done. The lead writer remembers almost none of it, For Yoshida, it was the same. A schedule that was a nightmare to survive, and then the whole of it just gone. The story was the big swing. They went darker and more grown up than the game had gone before. It hit players harder than anything they had made. People cried over it. For a lot of them, it was the most traumatic thing the game had ever put them through, and years later, they still have not shaken it. The people who wrote it never expected the anger though. The letters that came back were furious enough to make them fear for their life. One part of it did not land though, the raid. He pushed it too hard. The hardest players had been asking for more of a fight, so he swung hard the other way. The new one, the most punishing thing in the game, the kind of fight those diehards lived for, came out so brutal that almost no one in the world could clear it. The only way through was to grind your character stronger, and the game handed that strength out a little each week. So you fought, hit the wall, and waited 7 days to try again. The word came back fast that it was too much, and they spent the next year walking it back. He never pretended they had got it right. One of his battle designers, walking through a town some while later, came on a crowd of brand new players with the little sprout icon bobbing over their heads and remembered, with a start, that the game was being built for them too. The raid they could fix. The people were the harder problem. The ones who had built all of this had run themselves right off the edge of something, and he could see it on them. So he did a thing he had never done before. He slowed the pace down on purpose and gave them all time to breathe, before driving any harder, costing the team he would need for whatever came next. What came next was Stormblood, a war of rebellion off in the east, and this time, they built it pretty cleanly. In this period, the studio around Yoshida had changed too. Back in the worst of it, everyone there had been sure the whole thing rested on their shoulders, that every small job was do or die. Now he looked around and saw a room full of people who had come at it the other way. They had been players first, in love with the game long before they ever joined it, so he would just go and ask them what they wanted to make. The job they built that time was the samurai. His artist sat down and drew the obvious one, the armored warrior out of an old Final Fantasy, and Yoshida sent it back. He wanted something different for his game, something simpler, not with the armor, but the bare kimono. That was how he had always pictured a samurai from a lifetime of Kurosawa films. A man who takes on the world in light clothes with just a single blade. But that alone would introduce a lot of new problems. Plain as it was, making it stand out on a screen took real work. The artist found the answer in a single color, a deep and quiet red. And after that, it became the look of the whole job from that point onward. When it came time to build the story, Yoshida and 2 of his writers holed up in a rented room in Tokyo for 3 full days. They walked out with the whole expansion. One of the 2 was Natsuko Ishikawa. No one outside that room knew her name yet. The raids they were out to get right this time. The trouble with the brutal one before had been everything that rode on it. The best gear in the game locked behind the fight almost nobody could finish. So they drew a line. The path everyone needed. They kept fair. The cruelty they built off to the side. A separate fight for the players who were never happy until the game threw everything it had at them and won. No one was forced through it, so they could make it exactly as merciless as they liked. The night that fight went live, they sat at their desks with the streams up on a second monitor. The best players in the world were tearing through it, calling it easy, and the team kept gritting at each other because none of them had found the real fight yet. The next day they watched those same players hit it and fall apart. Yoshida looked at all the despair pouring in and figured his battle team had to be the happiest men alive. The numbers made no sense though. Stormblood was the biggest launch the game had ever seen, players pouring in from all over the world, and this was the expansion with no new race and only 2 new jobs. Not even the people who built the game could explain it. Their best guess was word of mouth. Years of small things all adding up at once. The bigger the game got, the harder the company tried to lift him up and out of the room. A committee over the whole Final Fantasy name, a new title, a studio of his own to run. He took every bit of it, and never once handed off the job he had taken that first December. Instead, from that chair, he did the one thing you are never supposed to do with a hit. He went looking for people to come in and break it. The next expansion was Shadowbringers, and the first man he chased for it was about the craziest in the Japanese games business. A director named Yoko Taro, the man behind Nier, who made strange, brilliant games that were hard to put a label on, and he had never once worked on anything like this. Yoshida knew a straight pitch would only scare him off, so he took Taro and his producer out to dinner instead. The producer was Yosuke Saito. Years before, it was Saito who had come to Yoshida with an offer of revenge and pulled him into Square Enix in the first place. Now, here he was, on the other side of the table, the one getting talked into it this time. Yoshida told him nothing about why. He fed them some very good steak and the better part of 2 bottles of wine each, and once everyone was good and drunk, he finally asked if they wanted to make something with him. Taro would remember almost none of the evening. They had all been far too drunk for that. Saito felt like they had been conned, and the first thing Taro had said, back when Yoshida reached out, was to ask him straight if he had lost his mind and whether the game was going to be alright. He came in anyway, and what he wanted to know first was what the game would and would not let him do. Yoshida refused to say. Rules would only box him in. He would rather Taro just name the feeling he was after and let the team work out the rest. What they made together was a crossover raid, and it was pure Taro. He wrote it, dreamed up its final boss, and dropped his near androids and all the strangeness right into the middle of Final Fantasy. By all rights, a thing that odd should have clashed with everything around it. It didn't. Somehow, it fit. Taro was just one piece of what came next. The game, up until now, had always run on one iron rule. It was an MMO, built to be played with other people, and sooner or later the story would stop dead and put a dungeon in your path, a wall you could not get past until you teamed up with strangers to bring it down. For anyone shy of all that, that was where the story ended. So he tore it down. He found a way to send you into those dungeons with the story's own heroes at your back instead. The same friends you had been adventuring beside all along. So a player who never wanted to deal with a stranger could now go the whole way alone. But the biggest piece of all, the story itself, this time, was not his to write. It was Natsuko Ishikawa, the one from that rented room in Tokyo. She had started at the very bottom, back when the game first came up out of the ground, filling in the quest text nobody notices, the little errands tucked away in the corners of the world. She had spent years working her way up from there. The most ambitious story they had ever set out to tell was next, and she asked to write the whole of it herself, alone, and Yoshida said yes. He had been handed his own chance once, a long way back, when he was the nobody with nothing but the itch to build a world of his own. The writing nearly broke her though. Some nights she would end up in a park with her head in her hands, trying to find the way through. But in the end, she found it. And it came out the best thing the game had ever made. Shadowbringers, the high point of the whole long climb. The years people would still be pointing to a long time later. Some months after it landed, in a convention hall full of players, she stood up to say who she was, the one who had written it, and the room came up out of its chairs. She had not seen it coming. She stood there with her hands at her face while the whole place roared for her, the woman who had spent 6 years in the margins of stories that were somebody else's, and she could not hold it back. She wept in front of all of them for the thing she had made. Yoshida never left the chair he took that first December. He had only built the room up around it, year by year, until it was wide enough to hold a moment like this one. And then he had let it belong to her. Shadowbringers had taken the game higher than it had ever been, and right at the top of it, the man who had written its music got sick. Soken. He had been the first to say yes when Yoshida walked in to save the game, back when there was nothing yet to write music for. He had written their music ever since. It was cancer. He asked them to keep it from the team because he didn't want anyone's work to suffer from worrying about him. So the team never knew. Outside Yoshida and the man who ran the company, almost no one did. And Yoshida went back to work. He carried it for a year. Soken spent most of that year in a hospital bed, the year the world outside locked down. For the better part of 7 months, he didn't come out, and all that time, he kept working. That was his own doing. The same workload as ever, nothing made easier because he was sick. The two of them had set it up so he could work from in there. He had a reason for it though. With nothing to do, he would have nothing left to live for. Being treated like everyone else was the thing that got him through. So the music went out into the world. The team built it into the game and put it in front of the players, never knowing it had come from a hospital bed, from a man on chemo. The song he finished in there closed out the chapter they had told. To the Edge, it was called. That same summer, the lockdown had cancelled the festivals back home, the ones with the food stalls and paper lanterns people look forward to all year. So the players threw their own. Inside the game, in the housing wards, they built the festivals by hand, whole streets of them, house after house, dressed up in lights and summer ornaments. More of it, and better made, than Yoshida had thought possible. He snuck in to look. Nobody out there knew the director was standing in the crowd. And standing there, something came back to him. 20-odd years before, Yoshida had gone to a festival like it himself, except that one had been in a game as well. An old American one called Ultima Online, the first world he ever really lived in. Back then, the world he had been standing in belonged to someone else. This one was his own. All through that year, he kept driving into the office. He couldn't get anything done at home, so while the rest of the company worked out of their apartments, he came in and sat in the half-empty building, mostly alone. A year went by like that. Then, in May, it came out into the open at the game's fan festival. That was their big convention, the one where they show the players what is coming next. The pandemic had pushed it online that year, like everything else. On the closing night, Soken's band took the stage, the one he had put together to play the game's music live. Then he stood up, in front of the watching world, and told them what none of them had known. He had been sick the whole past year. What pulled him through was them, and what they made of the music he wrote from that hospital bed. He had come to believe a video game could actually heal a person. And Yoshida, standing there to close out the night, turned his back to the whole crowd. He had carried this a year, and now that it was finally out, he stood facing away from all of them, fighting not to come apart. Then he got himself together and turned back around. Welcome back, Soken. For a little while, that was all of it. He was back and the work went on. Then the rest of the world found it. That summer, they came pouring in, a flood of new players from everywhere, falling headlong into a game everyone had spent years walking right past. The fans helped it along with a joke of their own, a whole spiel they would run on anyone who came near, and it always started the same way. Have you heard of the critically acclaimed Final Fantasy XIV? They would say to anyone who so much as wandered near. Half a dare and half a welcome, over and over until it was everywhere. And the codes sold out, the digital ones and all, which was not supposed to be possible. The team was just then finishing the very thing all those people were waiting on. This was the end of the whole story. The story they had been telling since they tore the first game down and built it back. And it all came down to this one expansion, Endwalker. The thing was all but finished. The world was lined up at the door for it. And then he stopped everything. He pushed the release back 2 weeks. The reason he gave was himself. He had been playing the near final build, and he couldn't stop trying to improve it. This was the biggest moment in the story so far, and he hadn't been able to keep his hands off it. All that last polishing had eaten into the time the team had left. He blamed his own selfishness. The fault was his, nobody else's. So the date moved. The wait stretched 2 weeks longer. The line only grew. And that December, it finally went live. Endwalker. And it broke. The numbers that poured through were like nothing they had seen. Records on every front, more people online at once than ever before, until every server in the world hit its ceiling, the actual physical limit of the machines they had. The queues to log in ran thousands deep. People sat watching an error that told them, more or less, that there was a whole town's worth of players ahead of them in the line. They couldn't just buy their way clear of it either. This was the year the planet had run short on computer chips. There was no server hardware to be had at any price, not in time to do them any good. Underneath all of it, a bug that went right back to the start. back to the original game, the broken one from 2010, that they had torn down to the foundations and built back. It had been asleep in the code through the rebuild, and it woke up the night the whole world tried to log in at once. So he wrote the notices himself, down to a flat little reminder that no, hammering a dance emote would not sneak anyone past the idle timer. Then he stopped selling the game, pulled it from the shelves, so the people already inside could actually play. At the bottom of the notice, in his own name, an apology. For all of it, he was truly sorry. A launch this broken should have buried the game. Instead, the players turned around and gave it the highest player score of any game that whole year. And they did it while they were still stuck in the queues, still waiting their turn. The story they had been waiting a decade for was right there inside the expansion, the ending of it. The close of the entire saga, carried all the way home by the writer of Shadowbringers, the one who had wept on that stage. A door that couldn't begin to hold the crowd trying to come through it, and playing them all in, Soken's music. He had spent that year on chemo, writing from a hospital bed, and now he had folded a decade of everything they had ever made into one last theme, and he carried them all in through that door, into the room he had built. To Yoshida, at the one desk he had never once handed to anyone. The room the whole world was now trying to get into. He didn't stay to enjoy it. He never did. There was already a next thing, and he was already turned toward it. The saga was finished. A decade of story, start to finish, and somehow they had pulled it off. The best thing they had ever made, sitting right there behind them. Which left him with the hardest job in the business, following it. The next expansion, Dawn Trail, had to start a brand new story, right after the one that just ended the saga. A new world, a new lead nobody had met yet, and a new crew of writers too, because the woman who stood on that stage and cried was handing the pen to the ones coming up behind her. It all still ran on that same decade-old engine, the one they had been rebuilding even as they shipped it. And for the first time, it didn't quite land. Nothing blew up. There was no crater this time, no servers down, nobody locked out at the door. It was quieter than that, and harder in its own way to take. Dawn Trail came out, and the same players who once called a broken launch the best game of its year looked at this one and rated it the lowest the team had ever made. Not because it was bad, it just couldn't stand next to what came before. After a decade where nearly everything they touched had turned to gold, they had finally made one that was only good. And only good, after all that, felt like a fall. He took the blame for the slow pacing, and granted the team had maybe gotten a little too comfortable. And he wasn't going to live or die by the daily player numbers. He never had. The strange part is, taking the blame wasn't really even his job anymore. Somewhere in all the years of winning, the company had promoted him up and away from the work, onto the board. He had never wanted this seat. He had said so more than once, that he would rather just be making games, and a couple of years back, he had even tried to step down and been told no. So there he stayed, up in the room where they make the decisions about decisions, a long way from the desk. Then the company reorganized, the way big companies do. And this time, the reshuffle did what he hadn't managed to. It took the seat away. He let it go without a fight. But he kept the one chair he had never given up. The one he had held since the December it all first caught fire. Director and producer of Final Fantasy XIV. Both jobs, just as it had been from the start. There was a sixth world coming, at the start of 2027. Evercold. A frozen one, a shard of the world locked in an endless winter. And to get the game ready for it, he started pulling up the floorboards. A decade and change in, at the top of everything, with every reason on earth to just coast. He had built the world the whole world had wanted in. After the first time it wobbled, he was not about to sit back and watch it slide. The first thing he went after was the daily grind, the login you owed the game every single day, the little chores you ran so you wouldn't fall behind, showing up tomorrow and the day after and the one after that. He had decided that didn't hold anymore. And a newcomer looks at the veterans hundreds of hours ahead and just sees a wall too high to bother climbing. So he was building something looser in its place, Log in when your life lets you. A long Sunday, an hour here and there across a week, or nothing at all for a stretch, and none of it would set you back. A game you could walk away from for a month and come back to right where you left it. He was changing how the jobs themselves played, too. He kept the old rotations every job had run since the relaunch and called that mode Reborn. Beside it, he built a second one, Evolved. Fewer buttons to press and more of whatever made each job its own, which was a little on the nose for a game that had already died once and come back as a Realm Reborn. The funny thing is, he was the one waving everybody off it. When people started calling the overhaul a second rebirth, he kept going, no, hold on, don't get carried away, it isn't that big. He had taken this game down to the studs once already. He knew exactly what that had cost. A decade in, he was still chasing the smallest details. For one of the two new jobs, a tank, the team drew up 5 completely different versions and kept throwing them at each other. They were hunting for the one that felt best to actually hold in your hands. 5 whole tanks to ship the one. Years back, someone had asked him whether he would ever do it again. Rescue some dying thing. Drag it out of the fire the way he had dragged this one clear. And he had left it off. Again, he didn't want to press his luck. And here he was, doing it anyway. Nobody forcing his hand this time. Nothing on fire. He had just decided there was a better version of the game buried inside the one he already made. And he meant to be the one to find it. So he was walking back to the same desk he had refused to leave for 15 years. Back into the oldest parts of it to change them. He was a kid once who worked out that the screen wasn't a wall, that you could pick up a controller and change what was on the other side of it. 40 odd years on, he had a home for a few million strangers behind him, and every reason in the world to sit back and enjoy it. And that's what he was still doing. Reaching back in, changing what was on the screen. He wasn't finished, and going by all of it, he never would be. If you're still here, thank you, truly. For anyone looking to support the channel directly, a simple like and a comment helps out a lot. I've recently launched the Bard's Circle here on the channel. It's a way for those who want to help keep these deep dives going to get a seat by the fire. You'll get early access to my documentaries and your name in the credits of these stories. Please don't feel any obligation. Honestly, your viewership is already more than enough for me. But for those who want to help fund the late nights of research and editing, it is incredibly appreciated. Join the circle by clicking the join button below. See you in the next chapter.